This is a continuation of America's Two Just Wars, 1775 and 1861, by Rothbard. Part 2. The second Wilsonian excuse for perpetual war, particularly relevant to the Civil War, is even more utopian. The idea that it is the moral obligation of America and of all other nations to impose democracy and human rights throughout the globe. In short, in a world where democracy is generally meaningless and human rights of any genuine sort virtually non-existent, that we are obligated to take up the sword and wage a perpetual war to force utopia on the entire world by guns, tanks, and bombs. The Somalian Intervention was a perfect case study in the workings of this Wilsonian dream. We began the intervention by extolling a new kind of army, a new model army, if you will, engaged in a new kind of high moral intervention. The U.S. soldier with a care package in one hand and a gun in the other. The new Humanitarian army bringing food, peace, democracy, and human rights to the benighted peoples of Somalia, and doing it all the more nobly and altruistically because there was not a scrap of national interest in it for Americans. It was this prospect of a purely altruistic intervention, of universal love imposed by the bayonet, that swung almost the entire anti-war left into the military intervention camp. Well, it did not take long for our actions to have consequences, and the end of the brief Somalian intervention provided a great lesson if we only heed it. The objects of our humanitarianism being shot down by American guns and striking back by highly effective guerrilla war against American troops, culminating in savaging the bodies of American soldiers. So much for humanitarianism, for a war to impose democracy and human rights. So much for the new model army. In both of these cases, the modern interventionists have won by seizing the moral high ground. Theirs is the cosmic humanitarian path of moral principle. Those of us who favor American neutrality are now derided as selfish, narrow, and immoral. In the old days, however, interventionists were more correctly considered propagandists for despotism, mass murder, and perpetual war, if not spokesmen for special interest groups or agents of the merchants of death. Scarcely a high ground. The cause of human rights is precisely the critical argument by which, in retrospect, Abraham Lincoln's war of northern aggression against the South is justified and even glorified. The humanitarian goes forth and rights the wrong of slavery, doing so through mass murder, the destruction of institutions and property, and the wreaking of havoc which has still not disappeared. Isabel Patterson, in The God of the Machine, one of the great books on political philosophy of this century, zeroed in on what she aptly called the humanitarian with the guillotine. The humanitarian, Mrs. Patterson wrote, wishes to be a prime mover in the lives of others. He cannot admit either the divine or the natural order by which men have the power to help themselves. The humanitarian puts himself in the place of God. But, Mrs. Patterson notes, the humanitarian is confronted by two awkward facts. First, that the competent do not need his assistance, and second, that the majority of people, if unperverted, positively do not want to be done good by the humanitarian. Having considered what the good of others might be, and who is to decide on the good and what to do about it, Mrs. Patterson points out, of course, what the humanitarian actually proposes is that he shall do what he thinks is good for everybody. It is at this point that the humanitarian sets up the guillotine. Hence, she concludes, the humanitarian, in theory, is the terrorist in action. There is an important point about old-fashioned or classical international law, which applies to any sort of war, even a just one. Even if country A is waging a clearly just war against country B, and B's cause is unjust, this fact by no means imposes any sort of moral obligation on any other nation, including those who wish to abide by just policies, to intervene in that war. On the contrary, in the old days, neutrality was always considered a more noble course. If a nation had no overriding interest of its own in the fray, there was no moral obligation whatever to intervene. A nation's highest and most moral course was to remain neutral. Its citizens might cheer in their heart for A's just cause, or if someone were overcome by passion for A's cause, he could rush off on his own to the front to fight. But generally, citizens of nation C were expected to cleave to their own nation's interests over the cause of a more abstract justice. Certainly, they were expected not to form a propaganda pressure group to try to bulldoze their nation into intervening. If champions of country A were sufficiently ardent, they could go off on their own to fight, but they could not commit their fellow countrymen to do the same. Many of my friends and colleagues are hesitant to concede the existence of universal natural rights, lest they find themselves forced to support American or worldwide intervention to try to enforce them. But for classical natural law international jurists, that consequence did not follow at all. If, for example, Tutsis are slaughtering Hutus in Rwanda or Burundi, or vice versa, these natural lawyers would indeed consider such acts as violations of the natural rights of the slaughtered, but that fact in no way implies any moral or natural law obligation for any other people in the world to rush in to try to enforce such rights. We might encapsulate this position into a slogan: rights may be universal, but their enforcement must be local. Or, to adopt the motto of the Irish rebels, Sinn Féin, ourselves alone. A group of people may have rights, but it is their responsibility and theirs alone to defend or safeguard such rights. To put it another way, I have always believed that when the left claims that all sorts of entities, animals, alligators, trees, plants, rocks, beaches, the earth, or the ecology have rights, the proper response is this: when those entities act like the Americans who set forth their Declaration of Rights, when they speak for themselves and take up arms to enforce them, then and only then can we take such claims seriously. End of part 2.